Welcome. Good evening. On behalf of the commissioners and staff, I would like to welcome you to the May 23rd, 2023 City of Roseville Public Utilities Commission meeting. This 7-member commission is responsible for studying and advising the City Council regarding all utilities owned or operated by the city, including electric, water, wastewater, and solid waste. The Public Utilities Commission advises the City Council regarding planning, rates, public information, cable television franchises, and other matters relating to such enterprises, and may also hear citizen complaints as to operation or rates. The Public Utilities Commission also advises the City Council regarding the activities of such joint power agencies as the city may be a member of or which relate to such utility enterprises. At this time, I would like to ask that everyone please put your electronic devices on silent. Lynn, could you please call the roll for today? Chair Knox has been excused from tonight's meeting.
Okay. Commissioner Bielski?
Here.
Commissioner DeMarchi?
Here.
Commissioner DeLacy?
Here.
Commissioner Granger?
Here.
Commissioner Meisch?
Here.
And Vice Chair Webb.
Here.
Thank you.
So Commissioner Granger, if you would lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Item number 4 on the agenda is public comments. This item is for anyone who would like to address the commission on any item that is not on tonight's agenda. When addressing the commission, please state your first and last name for the record. Not seeing any public comments, I'd like to move to the next item, which is approval of the minutes. Would anyone like to make a motion to approve the April 25th, 2023 minutes?
So move.
Okay. And do I have a second? Yeah.
Go ahead.
And all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed or abstentions?
Abstention.
Okay. Oh,
Just so you guys can vote on the minutes even though you were not there if you want to. You can abstain, but you're allowed to. Right.
Well, and also yes.
Next on our agenda for tonight is requests and presentations. Item 6.1, Roseville Electric Utility Monthly Update is going to be reported by Electric Utility Director Dan Beans, summarizing the monthly status of electric utility activities for information.
Thank you, and good evening, Honorable Vice Chair and Commissioners. So I am Dan Beans, your Electric Utility Director. I'll provide a brief highlight of a few things that are happening and take any questions as well. So I understand that you did receive a general information memorandum regarding the hydro surcharge, and some of you may have been surprised to see it did go down from last year, but you might have thought it should have disappeared with the heavy rain and snowfall. With our new methodology, we look at actual expected deliveries from both NCPA, from our hydro there, and also from the federal government, the Bureau of Reclamation. And if you look at the reservoir levels, all of them look really good, except Trinity Lake is, I think, still below 40%. And Trinity Lake is a snow-filled lake, so it does tend to fill up later, but after several years of drought, it's been staying super low. So the Bureau at this point, I'm hearing, is not releasing any water from Trinity into the Sacramento Valley through their system. The reason that's important is every drop of rain in Trinity goes through at least 4 turbines, Trinity Dam, and then down a penstock into Whiskeytown Lake through Carr Powerhouse, and then down through Spring Creek, I believe, and then through Keswick into the Sacramento River. So that energy it's a lot of energy. Those are very valuable rain and snowdrops, and that's about 30% of the Central Valley Project output. And so that curtails what we're going to get. So, yeah, please, you have a question?
So that water's going for salmon, right?
Yeah, it's just going down the Trinity at this point. But they're trying to let the lake fill up a little bit instead of just dumping it down in Sacramento. So it's a big hit for power, but that's what's going on here.
The question, as it fills up then, because it'll fill up later, will it then be a source of power?
Yeah, once it fills up, it'll be great. But Trinity is a pretty big lake. It's like 422 miles of shoreline, quite a few acre feet, and so it does take several years sometimes to get back to full. So anyway, I wanted to explain that. So the other thing that's been going on is I went to Cap, and I also went to NCPA's federal conference. So I was in D.C. for 2 weeks straight, and a lot of what I was doing was advocating and educating members of Congress, their staff, some federal regulators, and administration. The two topics I was carrying forth were supply chain, which I've been doing since I came here about 15 months ago. It's a big deal, still is a big deal. Our staff created these very awesome flyers that kind of have a picture of the grid and show what happens when you lose a distribution transformer, how you can't get your electric car charged, you can't feed your solar back into the system, all these things. So it's a big deal. The progress in federal government, I've been on the Tiger team most of this time, been constantly advocating. Not a lot happening. There's some serious flaws in what's going on federally as far as having manufacturing, having raw materials. So it's not going to get better anytime soon, especially as we continue the electric car march, which is great. But the electric cars compete for the steel with the transformers, and it's limited supply. So the other topic I've been hammering is the Advanced Clean Fleets rule, which is a California rule. But I wanted to let Washington know what silliness was happening in California in regards to having zero-emission line trucks and how problematic that will be and how harmful that will be to the resiliency and restoration times of the grid. What I've heard, the answer to us is, how are we going to charge our truck in the middle of a mutual aid event or somewhere out in the woods, or actually in a right-of-way or anywhere where there's not power, because that's why we're there. They tell us to pull a generator behind our truck. So that is not a good solution. The net carbon there, I don't think really works out if you do the math. The trucks are a tool. They have hydraulics that hold the truck stable while they're working on it, while they have the bucket up. Those trucks hold up poles. We leave the truck out in the field. It could be for days while we change out people and bring it fuel. That vehicle is a habitat for the workers. If it's hot, they have to get in there once in a while per OSHA to get cooled back down to stay safe. If it's cold, they have to get in there to get warm. This is not a vehicle that you want to be unreliable and to be dependent on the grid to charge it up. So I think the federal government should be watching that and intervening as much as they can. They're very sensitive about, well, we don't want to step on California. I'm like, yeah, well, if this infection leaves California, the rest of the grid's going to get impacted as well. So anyway, it's a big deal. It's a bad rule and should be reconsidered, and we're trying to fight it. We actually have introduced a bill to try to fight it legislatively. So stay tuned on that. Amber will give you a bunch more information on legislative stuff. On a state level, tomorrow I get to go testify at an informational hearing with the Assembly Utilities and Energy Committee regarding electrical distribution planning. They're wanting to know, why it's taking so long to get people connected and new projects and all that, and what's happening, what's impacting it, how are people working around it. And so we'll be there along with some other, I'm also the president of CMUA, so I'll be kind of representing public power in general, but also Roseville. So, and finally, as you're aware, next week we have a strategic planning workshop, and you should have that agenda. And we're going to get together with you and other community partners, and the trajectory we're setting for the strategic plan, giving where California is with the rules and glide slopes for greenhouse gases and electric vehicles and all that. We're looking at 2035 instead of a normal 5-year projection for a strategic plan. We're looking out more like 12 years because we need to get that slope right because things are changing fast. Of course, we'll have tactics and things that are more pertinent in year by year, but we need that longer view glide slope so we can make sure we can land when we still have enough fuel to land. So with that, I'll stop and take any more questions.
Are there questions over here?
What are the chances of getting the government to reverse course, state government, regarding
The clean fleets.
electrification?
Oh, and in general for the whole thing, like transportation and like slow down a little bit and let
Right,
technology
right.
and business catch up. I think it'll have to take a lot of failures, grid resiliency failures. We came close last year. Had to do an Amber Alert to keep the lights on. That's not, I hear we moved up from the 5th largest economy to the 4th. I don't know how you sustain that with a grid that's on the edge, and with costs rising. If you want people to electrify, if you make it so expensive, why would they? Like, it's
Right.
there's going to have to be some balance and some incrementalism and some common sense, and hopefully some listening to the people that actually do the work to get it right.
Right.
Any other questions?
What's the main source behind the supply chain issues?
Well, one of them is labor. Labor's a big deal. A lot of these factories, the transformer factories, are down in the south, and they have trouble. People they don't want to work too much because then they won't get their government benefits, so they want to, kind of find that sweet spot, get as much free money. They need to pay more, basically. But I think they can get over that, but then the problem is steel. So there's only one steel manufacturer left in the United States that makes the grain-oriented electrical steel that they need in the transformers, but that same factory could also switch over and make non-oriented electrical steel for the electric motors in electric cars. So then they got to decide, okay, what's more profitable? And then in the midst of all that, while we're meeting with the Department of Energy and trying to work on solutions, the Department of Energy puts out a notice of proposed rulemaking to change the efficiency standards even higher than they are now on transformers, which is disrupting an already disrupted supply chain. Now, and the change is so drastic, it's going to change from that GOES steel to amorphous steel, and so it's going to change the whole process. So manufacturers that were about to add more process lines to build more transformers are now going to go, oh, well, then we got to build them differently. It's going to be, can't use it in 4 years, so why would you invest? So that, if there was just one message that state and federal, if they could just hear us, certainty. People need to know there's some certainty.
Right.
Like all these goals, and you hear from Amber, like back in the day, they make a goal, and then 3 years later, they move it closer, and move it closer, and move it closer. It's like, how is anybody supposed to respond to that? Like,
Crazy.
you got to slow down, let businesses, let people respond. Otherwise, you're going to make it so unaffordable and so unattractive. So we do what we can.
You had a source in South Korea. Has that disappeared, or?
Yes, it disappeared because another company, who I will not name, we ordered 50 from one company and 50 from another, both from South Korea. One of them fell through and couldn't get us anything, and the other one dropped our order because another company ordered 40,000 transformers.
40,000?
Yeah.
Could it be Florida, maybe, or someplace that?
No, closer by, but I won't say who.
Okay. Any more questions over here?
Man,
I get the impression that staff is kind of fighting this battle alone. And would it help if there was a letter from the chair on behalf of the commission on all of these issues, and particularly when we get to a rulemaking comment period, which is when, or has it happened?
Well, the Advanced Clean Fleets, while I was in D.C., they actually had their meeting and adopted it. And they ignored all of our comments, and CMUA commented, NCPA commented, everybody commented. With the Department of Energy on the transformer efficiency, American Public Power commented, home builders teamed up and partnered with us, the co-ops, like thousands of agencies across the country are asking, please hold on this, please wait. Let us fix the supply chain first before you change how we build the transformers. It doesn't help. So going out there and talking to them does seem to help. You just got to find a regulator that's got the willpower.
Speaking of, and not to be dropping names, and then I'll have to get approval from council. Do we talk to Kevin Kiley? Are we talking?
Oh,
Okay.
yeah. No, in fact, he was, I met with him a few weeks ago, and He was ready to write. He already signed on a letter, I believe, on advanced clean fleets.
Not sure about that.
Not sure about that. But when I was there, he said he would do more for us. So he actually is willing to do practical things. He's, of course, one person. But, yeah, he's been very supportive. And so meeting with him, I met with him personally one week, and then the next week I met with some of his staff on the same issues. And so he's definitely been responsive, though.
Questions on this side? Any other questions from commission? Is there anyone from the public who would like to come forward and address the commission on this item?
Good evening. My name is Lauren Meeks Harris, and I'm a resident here of Roseville. And my particular question is more to the gentleman who just gave the presentation. And full disclosure, in a different lifetime, I actually used to work for the Bureau of Reclamation. And so my question more so to you is, anybody looking to put a lawsuit together? Luckily, I'm not an attorney, so it's something in the back ear, not necessarily you, but maybe all the parties involved.
Against the reclamation?
Yes, that not just them. I'm not recommending that at all. Like I said, I'm not an attorney. My daytime job is I'm a paralegal, but I'm looking from the standpoint, the best way to get the government's attention,
Right. Well,
unfortunately, is a lawsuit. I used to work in federal records, and when there's a lawsuit, you get every single type of information that you're looking for.
right. Joe, would you like to comment on this?
What I would say is that if you think about each city has at least one attorney that's sort of representing its interest, and there are dozens of cities in the Sacramento area. And so I am part of a group of multiple attorneys that are constantly working with the Bureau of Reclamation on, trying to find the happy medium. And I think Sean, is one of the ones from our environmental utilities group that certainly deals with this on a day-to-day basis. And so, yeah.
Well, I'm looking beyond that. We're having not just our city and our regions probably going to have issues, but has any of the state attorneys or anybody else. I'm just looking at the regulations that are coming down very quickly, and what's going to end up happening is it's not fun, and it's happened to me. I've had to study during candlelight, during the gray outs. That should give you kind of ages me here. And also the second brownouts. I've had to study by candlelight, and I don't want to work by candlelight. So I'm looking at it as hopefully before, I know you already said you went before the rulemaking and they only listened to you so much. My hope is that maybe some other state attorney generals and other people who are looking to go around the regulations will see that what California is doing is harming our environment. This simple fact. I'm also looking at it from a regional perspective as well, and I think you'd get more support than you'd know, looking at how the government is structured. As you know, this is, in this area, is only what do they call it, the regional office. That's where I used to work. And then they have, our next level would be going to Denver. So
Right.
That's all. But anyway, TMI, but thank you. I appreciate you hearing me out here. I just wanted to kind of get to the bottom to see if every tool has been kind of used at this point.
Here, I'll give you the lawyer answer then, is we always are exploring all of our options. How about that?
Okay. Well, thank you. I just like to keep the lights on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment today. And I'd like to also thank Dan for his update. Our next item is the update on the electric legislative and regulatory process. And this presentation is by Roseville Utility Government Relations Administrator Amber Lixt, summarizing our key energy-related legislation and regulation. So this is an informational presentation.
Thank you, Vice Chair Webb and Commissioners. As you just heard from Dan, legislative and regulatory advocacy is really a priority for the department and the city. So I thought I would just start by kind of talking about some of our legislative and regulatory advocacy efforts and how we go about taking positions to start out the presentation. So our legislative platform is what guides our legislative advocacy throughout the year, and that's developed annually at the beginning of the year. And this year we're tracking over 150 state and federal bills in the electric department. We have dedicated resources, staff, and lobbyists to ensure that the business interests are covered in state and federal venues. And then we also work closely with our trade associations to shape legislation throughout the legislative session. And those trade associations are the California Municipal Utilities Association, the Northern California Power Agency, and the American Public Power Association. In terms of taking positions on legislation, legislative positions are really driven by the following considerations: impacts to the department and the city, our trade association and our allies' positions, the timing of the legislative calendar, and then politics surrounding a particular issue. So we take a support or oppose position. That means that we've given verbal or written representation to the author, either directly or through our trade associations or our state lobbyists, that we are in support or opposition to a measure. If we take a support if amended or an oppose unless amended position, that's similar verbal or written representation directly or through our trade association, that amendments are needed to gain full support, or in terms of oppose unless amended, that amendments are needed to remove our opposition. And these positions are based on the premise that the bill can be fixed. And then a watch position means that we may be working to address our issues without the need to formalize a position. So that actually could be a lot of work going on with the author's office without having to formalize a position. And then or waiting to officially engage at a later time, depending on the considerations noted above, like the timing of the legislative calendar or politics surrounding a particular issue. So in terms of some of the legislation that we're tracking this year, I wanted to start with AB 538 by Assemblymember Holden, which we have a watch position on, and this is related to a multi-state regional transmission system. Essentially, the goal of this bill is to move forward the concept of a regional electric grid that would be broader than just California, such that other states in the West could join. And this would require a fully independent board, not one that's solely appointed by California. So that's really the change in governance that this bill is looking to change. This has been an ongoing discussion for several years. This bill has actually just been made a 2-year bill, which means that it won't be decided in 2023, but we'll have longer to discuss the topic, which is probably warranted given all of the implications that this bill has. And so it has until 2024 to pass. Another bill that we also have a watch position on is AB 914, Friedman, on electrical infrastructure. And this bill recognizes that additional infrastructure is needed to accommodate California's electrification goal, and it requires state agencies to complete environmental review of electrical infrastructure within 2 years of a complete application. It's really looking at kind of streamlining the permitting process. So in the case that the state agencies do not meet that 2-year deadline, they'd have to submit an explanation to the legislature, and they would have to identify potential impacts to electric system resulting from delays. So Roseville is generally supportive of a streamlined review process. We're continuing to watch this bill at this time because we think that there may be additional amendments that come into this bill that come into play later. The next bill, AB 1482, has to do with electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And this bill would have established 125 business day average service energization time for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. It would require annual reporting to the CEC on service energization time. But the reason why we have an oppose unless amended position on this bill is because a lot of these timelines did not consider supply chain or other disruptions that could affect that 125-day timeline. We were also seeking that timeline as a target for consideration at the local level, not a set statewide standard. I'm happy to report that this bill did get just held in the Appropriations Committee, so it's not one that we'll have to continue to work on the rest of this year. So we think that's a good outcome of some of our efforts on this bill. The following bill, AB 1594, this is a topic that Dan discussed in part of his update. And this bill is largely a counter response to the Advanced Clean Fleet rule that was established by CARB earlier this year that would require 100% zero-emission vehicle purchases beginning in 2027. And those purchases would apply to utility fleet vehicles, like Dan mentioned, our line trucks. So it's expected to have critical impacts to utility fleets where comparable zero-emission vehicles are not available or do not meet the performance specifications required to do the job. AB 1594 really counters that rule and ensures that utility vehicles can continue to maintain reliable service, respond to emergencies, and provide mutual aid. And this bill is sponsored by our trade associations, CMUA, NCPA, and SCAPA. Next is SB 308 on Carbon Dioxide Removal Market Development Act by Senator Becker. And we have a watch on this bill. And this bill would require the California Air Resources Board to certify carbon dioxide removal processes and create negative emission credits from that program. So starting in 2028, it would be a new regulation for emitting entities to purchase negative emission credits with a minimum of 1% of purchases of emission to account for emissions in 2030, increasing to 100% of emissions by 2045. This has potential cost implications to electric utilities, especially folks like us that operate natural gas generation. So we're watching this bill for now because really on the timing considerations of the legislative calendar. But now that this bill has made it through appropriations going to the floor, we're likely going to start having a different position on this bill as it moves to the second house. So more on that, but I know lots of folks in industry are going to be opposing this bill because this is an additional regulation on us on top of the cap and trade program that we already participate in. And then finally, to address a couple of the federal issues that we're watching is HR 763 Rochester on Supply Chains Act. And this is a measure that we're looking to support. It establishes an Office of Manufacturing Security and Resilience in the Department of Commerce to assess a strategy to counter threats to critical supply chains. And then it would require every 4 years for the Department of Commerce to report to Congress on critical supply chain issues. We like this bill because it may be an avenue to address the distribution transformer issues associated with the supply chain issues associated with distribution transformers that Dan addressed. And currently we're trying to work on what inserting language to speak more to those electric sector issues, what that would look like. So we're hopeful that we can get something like that included in the bill. And then finally, HR 1837 by Kustoff on Investing in Our Communities Act. This is bipartisan legislation to restore tax-exempt advance refunding for municipal bonds. It would allow the department to save money in interest costs by refinancing outstanding debt to a lower interest rate. It allows governments to take advantage of favorable market conditions to reduce borrowing costs. Could be a financing tool to stimulate economic development, create jobs, and save taxpayer dollars, and also reduce borrowing costs, which frees up resources for other energy projects in the future. So that's just a short selection of the bills that we're monitoring this year, and I'm happy to answer any questions that the commission may have.
SB 308, the certified carbon dioxide removal processes?
Yes.
What are those processes?
It's usually carbon capture and sequestration, so a lot of that stuff is really just developing right now. I think the bill specifies additionality, so I'm not sure that things like, I'm not sure all what would qualify for that yet, and I don't know that that's all fully spelled out in the bill yet either. But I think the main takeaway for us is potential cost implications of another regulatory mandate that we'd have to.
Sure, so we don't exactly know, there aren't any yet, right? Any certified processes that work? And so we don't know what they cost, but we know that by 2045, we have to buy 100% of whatever it takes to cover all the emissions from our, yeah, it's exactly as bad as I thought it.
Right.
Any other questions? Please, yes.
On the ISO replacement, I thought Jerry Brown had signed like a tri-state agreement that we were all tied together already. Am I missing something, or did I?
Yeah, I think so. What this bill really focuses on is the California Independent System Operator has a board of governors that are appointed by our governor. So if you're another state that wants to join in a regional transmission operator, it obviously won't work to have that board governed only by California entities, for example, right? That wouldn't be in the interest of that particular state. So this bill is trying to fix that to allow for other states to join. But to be honest, the bill has had a hard path in the legislature so far. I mean, this is kind of the second phase of this legislation running. I think the first time it ran was in 2017, and it had an uphill battle. There's a lot of labor concerns with the bill because labor wants generation to be built in state, not necessarily outside the state. And if you open up broader electricity markets, there is the potential for out-of-state resources to come in. So there's a lot of nuances associated with the regional grid, but I think that's kind of an
I've never
overview.
liked the concept of the ISO to begin with. I always thought that was concentrating too much power and decision-making in one person, even though he's appointed by the Energy Commission. I've never felt, I know that was, a lot of that was a response to Enron and what had happened, but I never liked that, excuse me, but yeah.
Any other questions on this side? Over here? Is there anyone from the public who would like to come forward and address the commission on this item? Not seeing any members of the public. I'd like to thank you for your update, Amber. Our next item is our Roseville Electric Budget Overview, and this report is by Assistant Electric Utility Director Eric Campbell, summarizing the electric utility budget, and it's a informational presentation.
Thank you. Good evening, Chair Webb, Commissioners. Eric Campbell, Roseville Electric. And again, this is going to be a brief update on our proposed budget for FY24. Looking at the budget overview, of course, this was developed in alignment with the City Council strategic plan, in particular balancing rates with services in the face of onerous mandates and rising cost. However, it does position our department to deliver a safe, reliable electricity. So there's no interruption of services, no reduction of services, I should say. We don't foresee anything like that occurring in the next fiscal year. Also, this maintains compliance with our financial policies and metrics, in particular our debt service coverage ratios and days cash on hand. Next is just to kind of refresh you all with what's in the electric budget. Of course, electric operations, capital investments. We have $25 million in capital investments in this proposed budget. Franchise fee, that's up to $8.1 million. That's the 4% that we pay to the city that funds fire and police, parks and recs. Basically, it's in the city charter. It's not an amount we can avoid. We must pay that. And that number has increased about $3 million since I've been here over the past 5 years, so it's becoming significant in our budget. Streetlights, we fund the streetlight budget. We're at the tail end of a project to replace all the streetlights with LEDs. Traffic signals, we fund the traffic signal department, $2.7 million. Utility billing, it's a 50-50 endeavor with EU, environmental utilities. That's about $4.2 million for electric. The Utility Exploration Center, that's about $600,000. Again, that's another shared enterprise with environmental utilities. And then finally, we pay about $7 million to the city for shared services, IT services, and allocation of financial costs, city manager costs, legal costs. And so that's about $7 million. Now let's get into some numbers. I'm going to focus on the proposed FY24 column and how it relates to budget FY 2023. That's the first column. The forecast is there just for reference. The forecast is just where we think we're going to end up in 23. But to do an apples to apples comparison, I'm going to explain the variances between FY24 versus the approved budget for FY23. So energy sales there in the top row, we're forecasting revenue of $186 million. That's 15 million more than we had forecasted in FY23. A big part of that is the energy surcharge that we brought forth previously. The 8%, that's about $13 million of the 15. We also have a previous rate increase that's baked into this. It's the 3% that was approved 2 years ago. That's $3 million. So those two combined are $16 million. Our hydroelectric surcharge is down about $1 million for FY24. So those three items collectively make up the $15 million difference between 24 and 23. Other revenue, that number is forecasted to be $12 million in FY24. That's up about $10 million versus 23. The big number there is we're planning to sell some greenhouse gas allowances, about $9 million worth, and that $9 million will actually fund the AMI project. Next, operating expenses. Operating expenses are up significantly. They're up about $24 million. When you look at 24 compared to 23. No surprise here, the big number there is power supply. Those costs are up $18 million. And if you recall, that's the big reason why we put the surcharge in place. Labor's up $2.9 million. That's all tied to collective bargaining agreements. And then also the O&M and capital split for labor, how we allocate labor between O&M and capital is a little bit different in FY24. We're doing a little bit less capital work. And so some of that labor is coming back to the expense side. So power supply of $18 million, labor of $2.9, and the O&M capital split of $1.5 make up the variance between 24 and 23. Next, I want to call your attention to non-operating expenses. It's about midway down the page. We're forecasting $17 million for FY24. That number was $20 million in 23. Big number there is we paid down some debt earlier this year, about $51 million worth. And that reduced our debt service by $5 million. And so you're seeing the benefit of that in our FY24 forecast. But it's also being offset by an increase in the franchise fee of $1 million. So those are the two drivers, the two big drivers, I'll say, in the non-operating expenses. Jumping down to capital revenue, you can see we're forecasting $6 million in FY24. That's down a little bit from the estimate back in 23. And that's basically showing that we're planning on less developer work in FY24 than we did in FY23. But we are proposing a balanced budget. You see that zero there in the bottom of at the FY24 column. So our revenues are forecasted to cover our expenses in FY24. So I'm going to pause there, see if there's any questions before we move on to other pages.
Please, go ahead.
What do we have in reserves? This is totally neutral on reserves.
Right. From the reserves perspective, rate stabilization fund, there's about $30 million in there. Now, one nuance with the rate stabilization fund, those don't help us when it comes to the debt service coverage ratio I mentioned earlier. The debt service coverage ratio is entirely based on the revenue you generate in the year and the expenses you incur. So we can't use that money to mitigate that ratio.
Yeah, what I was getting at in my question is, I'm an advocate of having enough reserves that if something goes blip in the night, you can cover it and.
Yeah, we have reserves if something happens from a power supply perspective that we can lean on.
And rate stabilization fund, I understand, is the proper name for reserves, but, I would think that you'd be slowly building reserves. As the system gets more expensive, as it gets older, you need to have reserves in order to.
Yeah, we're probably going to bring a request at some point, and actually during the next rate case, to propose building a value into rates that actually puts money into the rate stabilization fund. Maybe 1 or 2%, we build that into the rates to actually replenish the fund. And the reason we need to do that is our rates are not set up to yield a profit, if you will. Right. It's basically, we're trying to forecast revenues to meet expenses. So there's no contingency built in. So we're going to most likely propose something where we can, pull a little bit of money together and put it into a rate stabilization fund.
Thank you.
Questions on the numbers?
Yeah.
Okay. Next is the financial policies. These are two of our I'll say, our most important financial policies. So for FY24, our days cash on hand, we're forecasting 257 days cash on hand. Our target is 250. That 250 is a minimum, so we're right there on the edge. And that's by design. We actually used some of our cash earlier this year to pay down the debt I mentioned earlier, the $51 million. And we knew we'd be, close, but we'd still be above the target. Debt service coverage ratio, the target is 2. We're forecasting 4.21, and that's simply a byproduct of paying down that debt. Our debt service is $5 million less, and so it increases that factor because of that pay down. Next, strong financial foundation, cost-based and competitive rates. I'll share with you that most recently, when we looked at rates and how we compare regionally in comparison to SMUD, residential customers and all commercial customers, we average about 5 to 13% less right now. And then looking more like across the state, over almost every municipality, the IOUs, et cetera, we're third in the state in terms of costs. So we're a very low-cost provider, and we're pretty proud of that. Continued emphasis on long-term planning and cost discipline. We're looking at a 10-year process from a capital perspective. We're trying to really sharpen our pencils on understanding like what our capital requirements are going to be going forward. It was 5 years in the past. We're going to be looking at 10 years. Substation transformer now, it takes 3.5 years for delivery, so it almost eats up the entire 5 years that we had in the prior forecast. So we're looking at much further. And also from a cost discipline perspective, when you look at our budget, power supply and labor make up 85% of our operating costs. So there's not a whole lot of levers left. We have committed to not adding any new positions. Any positions that do come open, it's really a highest and best use. So we reclass those into positions that we find are most important and critical. And then lastly, our debt ratings are great still. We're AA. That's squarely in the mid-range of squarely in the mid-high range, so 2 notches below AAA. So we're in pretty good shape from that perspective. Now we're going to talk a little bit about strategic plan and some of the initiatives we have planned for FY24. First, we'll start with remain fiscally responsible in a changing world. We are going to be evaluating potential electric rate cases going forward. The costs on the power supply side, they have, I'll say, calmed down a bit, quieted down a bit, but they're still elevated compared to what they were in the past. Looking out over the next 5 years, we see power supply costs right now, as we sit here, going up 30%. So that's a pretty significant number. And as I mentioned earlier, power supply costs and labor are 85% of our costs. So those are costs that we're most likely going to have to pass on to customers. Organization restructuring, I think Dan mentioned it earlier. We just completed our restructuring process. Well, actually, we're close to completing it. We're in the midst of the interview process to get all the assistant directors in place. Integrated resource plan, our resource plan, we file a resource plan with the CEC every 5 years. We're getting very close to submitting that in the beginning part of next year, wrapping up all the outreach right now. And as a reminder, that's our plan for how we're going to source our fuel in the future. And it's really predicated on 3 things. We want a reliable supply that's affordable and also meets all these compliance requirements that we're facing. And then lastly, identify and evaluate grant opportunities. This is something that Dan's advocated for quite a bit for since he's joined Roseville. We submitted a grant application for a $450,000 grant a few months back for some SCADA equipment. So we're hopeful that we're actually awarded that and we're able to use that to mitigate some of the cost on the capital side of the business. Next, enhance economic vitality. We always like to bring attention to our reliability here, our lowest cost. We think that's a big reason why Bosch chose to relocate to the service territory here. And then lastly, their support new development. We actually have a couple different substations planned. Right now, the Creekview sub, also the Roseville Industrial Park sub, and then a rebuild of the Vernon sub. That's pretty significant. We usually only build 1 sub every 5 years or so. So these are 3 that could be layered on top of each other. Next, invest in well-planned infrastructure, building electrification and electric vehicle programs. This is a annual goal that we have. It's a multi-year goal. It's not funded by customers at this point. Well, I shouldn't say that, but it's funded by public benefits. We're asked to set aside 2.85% of our revenues each year for programs like this, for low-income programs. So we use that money to pay for these programs. 10-year CIP, I mentioned the 10-year CIP earlier. We're really investing a lot of time on more long-term planning. Phase 2 of the legacy building build-out, that's the building across the street. That's floors 3 and 4. And then lastly, partner with other entities to support resource reliability. This is really the efforts that we've had with DWR, the Department of Water Resources, on the peaker units out there, and also possibly working with SMUD on Country Acres. Support community engagement and advocacy. I think both Dan and Amber gave you a lot of background on ledge reg, so I'm going to move on from this. It's an important item for us. We think it brings a lot of value for us, and so that's why you heard some of the commentary you did earlier. And then lastly, any other risks or challenges that are in this budget. I mentioned the power supply cost. Power supply costs, they're volatile. Even now, as we look at it, it's changing from week to week, month to month. The outlook is changing. So as we sit here right now, I wanted to bring up that the 8% that we put in on a temporary basis earlier this year, it's looking more and more like that may be brought back for a permanent action, that we'll propose it to be permanent, just the way power supply costs are forecasted right now. Economic uncertainty, inflation, we're seeing that across the business. Supply chain challenges, Dan mentioned those earlier. Air Resources Board regulations, we talked a lot bit about the diesel vehicles. There's also some other regulations that are going to be coming down the pike with respect to new vehicles. No more new vehicles after 2035 will be permitted to be sold in California, and I should say, gasoline-powered vehicles. Future rate adjustments, there are going to be future rate adjustments. We just don't know what they're going to look like at this point. Labor negotiations are a persistent risk, especially on the technical skill set side with respect to the 1245 union. There's a huge market for those resources, whether it be SMUD, PG&E, or other providers. So we're really competing with those folks. And then lastly, ledge reg. It's a major risk for us. And so with that, I'll take any questions that you may have.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to the strong financial foundation, the cost-based competitive rates. From what you were just saying, it seems like the gap between what the city of Roseville, and what PG&E and SMUD was has really shrunk. What's the reasoning behind that?
I wouldn't say it's shrunk. What I didn't mention earlier is that Roseville customers, in comparison to PG&E rates, save about $171 million a year. That number has grown over the past couple of years. If you go back 2 years ago, I think it was $125 million. So their rate increases that they've been pushing far outweigh what we've actually put in place recently.
Yeah, we're below half of PG&E.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Is there anyone from the public who would like to address the commission on this item? Not seeing any public comment, I'd like to thank you for your report.
Thank you.
All right, next up, we have the Environmental Utilities Monthly Update. This report is being given to us by the Environmental Utilities Assistant Director, Sean Bigley. He'll be summarizing the monthly status of the environmental utilities activities as an informational update.
Well, good evening, Chair Webb, or Vice Chair Webb, I should say, and members of the Public Utilities Commission. So I am Sean Bigley. I'm an Assistant Environmental Utilities Director. And so tonight, I just want to provide a few updates in terms of activities within the Environmental Utilities Department. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about a recent series of neighborhood cleanup events that occurred. We had an event on May 13th at Buljan Middle School and May 20th at Maidu Park. And essentially, residents were able to provide various items that they were looking to discard. And in that process, Waste Services was able to collect 38 bins of trash. And we unloaded approximately 700 vehicles, so very popular process. We do have two events coming up. Both are going to occur on June 10th, one at St. John's Church and the other at Sogstead Park. Shifting to the water utility, I want to report that our two new ASR wells located in the Solaire Drive area, as well as the other well at Westbrook. We're in the midst right now of basically testing out all the functionality, essentially commissioning those two facilities. That commissioning is going well in terms of getting those facilities up and running. And then in addition, and I'll talk a little bit about where we're at with groundwater recharge using our Section 215 contract. We've been able to utilize those wells during that recharge process, and I'll report out specifically on results related to that. Shifting to water efficiency, another event that occurred on May 20th is we had our 6th annual Mulch Mayhem event with the city of Roseville. So we had 19 employees that worked the event, and the event was actually held at the Coquiva front lot on Foothills Boulevard. And there was about 300 yards of mulch ordered, and as I understand it, that mulch goes in about 2 to 3 hours. So it's a very popular event. I was driving around in Roseville and I saw a few loads of mulch rolling around on the streets. So very popular. And the reason why we provide mulch is it's a good way to essentially maintain soil moisture, regulate temperature, things like that. So from an efficiency standpoint, it's really helpful for customers to utilize that in their yards and gardens. On May 17th, we had a significant event. This is actually City Council meeting where through a process that took about 2 years, we were able to negotiate a amendment to our Placer County Water Agency Middle Fork project contract. And essentially there's 14 elements that were part of that amendment. And I would say the most significant one was we were able to work with PCWA to essentially adjust the schedule, which currently the schedule eventually will get up to 30,000 acre-feet of raw water that's delivered through Folsom Reservoir to the Barton Road Water Treatment Plant. And during years considered most years, which are essentially kind of more in the normal to wet years, that a schedule will eventually adjust up to 44,000 acre-feet. So 10,000 acre-feet is set up as an option currently. So the city would pay 10% option fee to maintain access to that 10,000 acre-feet of additional PCWA Middle Fork project water. We also did a little bit of cleanup, if you will, related to a 4,000 acre-foot contract with the San Juan Water District. Instead of having that water, which is basically PCWA water, remarketed to Roseville through San Juan Water District, we opted to ask PCWA to directly provide that water to the city of Roseville. A big driver in why we were looking for additional water supply is the city of Roseville, as well as many cities in California, are subject to housing laws that are out there. The state's gotten very aggressive, if you will, in terms of trying to meet the housing needs in the state. Also really trying to deal with affordability. The housing element occurs on an 8-year basis. And what we're seeing is quite a bit of additional high-density housing that's occurring as infill development. And so from a water supply standpoint, what we want to make sure we're doing is preparing for that, those changes over time. And as that housing element adjusts every 8 years, it certainly will impact how much additional housing would occur. And a lot of that, again, is just infill-related development. And so this additional water supply will help us prepare for that going forward. Like I said, there's other amendments. I can spend an entire meeting talking about it, but those are the highlights of the contract amendment. And so the following day, attended the PCWA Board of Directors meeting, and the Board of Directors at PCWA also approved that contract. So we have a fully executed contract in place at this point. And then finally, I'll just conclude by talking a little bit about our current recharge operations. So recently, back in March, we were able to get a Section 215 water contract in place between the City of Roseville and Bureau of Reclamation, essentially to be able to schedule what's considered unstorable water from reclamation facilities and use that water for beneficial purposes. In this case, City of Roseville schedules this water to recharge the groundwater basin. So as it stands about this point in time, from January through about now, we've been able to recharge about 1,500 acre-feet worth of water utilizing our ASR wells. We do have a couple of more weeks left in terms of the initial schedule, so that number will go up. And then what we tend to do is we'll work with reclamation just to keep up to speed in terms of how snow melt's occurring. There's a lot of snow still up in the upper watersheds, so we're anticipating there's going to be more opportunity for us to utilize that unstorable water and recharge it proactively. So with that, I'll stop there and see if you have any questions for me.
Questions over here? Is there anyone in the public who would like to address the council on this group on those questions? Not seeing any public comment, I want to say thank you. Our next item on our agenda is a presentation from Environmental Utilities Legislative and Regulatory Update, and this is being given to us by Utility Government Relations Administrator Noel Maddock, summarizing the key water, wastewater, and waste service legislation and regulation, and this is an informational presentation.
Great. Good evening, Vice Chair Webb and Commissioners. Again, my name is Noelle Maddock, and I'm with the Environmental Utilities Department. I'm happy to be here this evening to share with you what we've been working on over the first 6 months of this year. But before I jump in, I would first like to introduce you all to Sarah Boudreau. She just joined the Environmental Utilities Legislative and Regulatory team this past November. She, prior to that, she worked in the legislature. So very lucky to have her, and she's been saving me. With that, I'll go ahead and jump into what you're going to be hearing about this evening. So far this year, the Environmental Utilities Department has been tracking 253 bills, and we've actively engaged on 39 measures. This evening, I will also be sharing information on the governor's May revise that was released this past Friday. And then I will touch on several bills that we're working on dealing with drought, operational constraints, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. I'm going to refer to it as PFAS from here on out, and then extended producer responsibility. Then I would like to cover the Environmental Utilities Department's activities dealing with the advanced clean fleets. You heard Electric talk a little bit about it as well. And then I'm going to end on a positive note on some our federal appropriations requests. So kicking it off, on May 12th, the governor released his May revise. Historically, this is a time when the state has begun to receive personal income taxes, and the governor revises his budget based on those new projections. Over the last few years, we've been seeing higher than anticipated revenues at this time. However, this year, we've seen a return of the lower than anticipated revenues, and the governor is now anticipating a $31 billion shortfall. This situation is punctuated by a shift in the timing of when taxes are going to be paid this year, and this is due to the emergency declarations throughout many of the counties. Tax returns, you've had an extension until October instead of the normal returns in April. So with that, they're projecting a $42 billion in that shifting from April to October. So the governor's plan to close the deficit gap includes spending reductions, trigger reductions, delayed spending, revenue borrowing, safety net reserve withdrawals, and then fund shifts. I'm going to talk more about the fund shifts because this more directly relates to water. In fact, earlier this year, we heard rumors early on that the governor was looking to shift some of the infrastructure spending that was coming from the general fund to a potential bond. And there are currently several bonds moving through the legislature for housing, homelessness, water, fire, climate change, the environment, and also energy. Staff has heard that the governor is now entertaining bonds at totals between 15 and 30 billion. It's going to depend on what the polling results come back that Californians are willing to vote for. The following shifts from that general fund to bond is going to be $270 million for water recycling, $169 million for salt and sea restoration, and then $60 million for SIGMA, and then $50 million for dam safety and flood management, and then $20 million for multi-benefit land repurposing. We're currently working through our associations on developing elements that we would like to see within a bond and particular asks that we would have should they move forward with one. And then of note, just because it plays into the Advanced Clean Fleet, the ACF rule is he did retain $443 million to support circular economies. Moving on to legislation, this year there are a number of drought bills ranging from upending the water rights system in California to environmental protection and conservation. This measure, AB 1572, some of us in the water industry have been kind of anticipating this over the last couple of years, but effectively beginning in 2028, commercial, industrial, and institutional, municipal, and multifamily properties would be prohibited from using potable water on what the bill defines as non-functional turf. This measure was significantly amended recently coming out of the fiscal committee, and it actually addressed a number of our concerns, such as adding language that is protective of our urban tree health. But the bill will still prohibit the use of potable water, and it would be on a tiered system. First, in 2028, local governments, regional public agencies, and public water systems would be prohibited from using water on non-functional turf. Then in 2029, commercial, industrial, and institutional. 2030 would move to multifamily and HOA common areas. And then affordable multi-family housing units or disadvantaged communities would be transitioned in 2031 or whenever the state makes funding available for those conversions in those communities. The next measure is AB 1072 by Assemblymember Wicks. This bill would require urban water suppliers and wholesalers to offer water conservation programs to low-income residents by January 1st of 2025. We already offer it to anybody who wants to participate. However, our gas our Cast for Grass program would then be required to set aside 40% of the funds allocated to the program just for low-income customers and disadvantaged communities. There are two major concerns that we have with this bill. The first being the potential conflicts with Proposition 218, and secondly, the city's future access to state assistance would be contingent upon our ability to meet that 40% threshold participation in our Cast for Grass program. The author's intent of the bill is to target the often hard-to-reach, low-income and disadvantaged populations. These populations are typically renters and oftentimes live in apartments. Staff is working through our statewide associations to develop suggested amendments that will help the author to achieve her intended goal and does not place water agencies in the position of violating Proposition 218. And I'm happy to report that this measure was actually held in committee recently, and that means that we'll have more time to work with the author. The next measures are dealing with PFAS. As the state and federal government grapples with how to address these forever chemicals through our legislative platform, Roseville is taking a proactive approach and is supporting source control measures. As a full-service city, we not only need to be concerned with PFAS in our drinking water, but we also have to address it in our wastewater and solid waste streams as well. I will note that Roseville is very fortunate. We have very clean water based upon our water sources. But that being said, I would like to share one of the 5 bills that we're tracking dealing with PFAS. The SB 414, I'm not going to cover because this bill was recently amended and it now deals with hydrogen. But 727 seeks to prohibit the use of PFAS in cleaning products. This measure actually just made it out of appropriations and is already in the Senate. The next 2 bills fall under the category of extended producer responsibility. In July of 2010, the City of Roseville Council adopted Resolution 10278, supporting extended producer responsibility. This is commonly referred to as EPR. This policy approach is one that places the responsibility cradle to grave on producers of the products that they create. At this time, we've identified 12 measures this year dealing with EPR. As the state has embraced the use of solar power and placed new requirements on housing developments to include solar on each new home built, there's currently no plan in place to deal with their disposal or recycling at the end of their useful life. These 2 bills are attempting to build that structure. AB 2 by Assemblymember Ward would place new requirements on manufacturers or their sales agents to develop a plan for the safe, convenient, and environmentally sound management and recycling of their solar panels that they offer in California. AB 1238, also by Assemblymember Ward, would require the Department of Substance Control to develop alternative management standards for solar panels and their components. This is necessary as there are parts and components of the solar panels and arrays that are considered to be hazardous. While neither of the bills are developing a true EPR program, staff is reviewing the bills and working with the California Product Stewardship Council to determine a path forward to address the best disposal and recycling methodologies for the solar panels. The next measure is SB 707, which is a first-of-its-kind EPR program for textiles. This bill pushes for the repair and reuse of products and for those that cannot be reused to be collected and recycled into fibers. This measure is sponsored by the California Product Stewardship Council, and if passed, CalRecycle would be tasked to establish regulations to implement this program, new program by January 1st of 2026. And this measure just recently made it out of the fiscal committee as well. Almost there, but now to advanced clean fleets. This is the fun one. I do understand that you have been previously briefed on the advanced clean fleet rule by EU and its potential impact to our energy recovery project that is converting our biosolids and organics into renewable natural gas to fuel our refuse fleet. I wanted to provide an update to the Commission on the recent action, which on April 28th, the Air Board adopted the ACF. This was after over 10 hours of testimony the day before. Roseville worked with our statewide associations like the California Municipal Utilities Association, the Association of California Water Agencies, and the California Association of Sanitation Agencies on various issues within the regulation. EU had a very unique issue based on the development of our EPR project, and we coordinated more closely with CASA, which is the sanitation agencies, on our biogas issue. While Roseville received recognition throughout the rulemaking process by board members for doing the right thing and creating that circular economy, they actually also directed staff to address our concerns. Unfortunately, what they presented to the Air Board did not address our needs, but the board was faced with an either up or down vote, and it became very clear that they were going to move forward with it, warts and all. Roseville, along with our association, shifted our efforts to obtain revisions to the implementing resolution. Working alongside with CASA and others, we were successful in obtaining amendments to the resolution that directs the Air Board staff to work directly with CASA and state agencies on developing markets for biogas, which currently there are none. The use in our refuse fleet and fleets is currently the highest and best use. So we also obtained the ability to address or revisit our unique issue in 2025. So while it's not a win, it's a continued conversation, and we do have the ability to potentially re-argue our issue in 2025 if there are no additional markets that come available for our biogas. And then I would like to end on a positive note. This year, EU submitted 2 community project funding requests to our federal delegation, and we are excited to share with the Commission that Senator Padilla has submitted both of our projects as part of his appropriations requests. Should we be successful in obtaining the funding, it will be used to offset ratepayer funds on these projects. We're still very early in the process. We probably won't know anything until this fall, but at least wanted to share that good news that at least we have a couple of projects in the mix. And with that, I've concluded my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any of your questions.
Any questions from this side? No? Over here? Yes, please.
Hey. Hi, Nicole. Very nice job. Thank you very much. You know, the news has been full of a deal on the Colorado River, although, as I've read closely, apparently it's only for half as much savings as the Bureau of Reclamation was after initially. But still, it's going to, as expected, cause a significant increase in the need for conservation throughout Southern California. And it looks like we're seeing a lot of legislation that's intended to help Southern California, you know, put in place rules so that they can, you know, meet the requirements of not having an adequate water supply. but we have an adequate water supply. And so the idea that our trees are going to have to suffer and our public landscaping is going to have to suffer, it just seems so grossly unfair. And I suppose that you're fighting the good fight, but they've got a lot more votes in Southern California than we do, so it's probably not an easy battle. But could you at least address that sort of issue of the current north versus south dynamic happening in these drought bills?
Civil war of water.
Working within the constructs of the statewide associations, there's a number of Southern California water agencies as well that are not thrilled with it. They also happen to do wastewater, which we do as well, which has other impacts when you're conserving so much. But getting to the outside, which is where the biggest cost savings can be.
Biggest water savings.
Biggest water savings. I haven't heard much of a rift or that tension between north and south. I don't know if Sean's heard of.
So we're supporting the All for One, even though they've got a much bigger problem than we do?
I will say they're equally fighting.
Yeah, and I just want to address, in terms of the policy push on water efficiency, the unfortunate thing is that if you actually look at the math in terms of what is actually effective in terms of creating new water supply through conservation, it's probably not the best route to put all of your sort of policy chips out to really address water supply issues. Really, the situation in the Colorado is complex, and it's largely a condition of just oversubscribed conditions on the river, right? And so, and that spans beyond California, obviously, but California is a contributor to that. And so, I think in terms of just the tension, and Noel has, noted that there isn't probably necessarily that strong sort of north-south perspective per se. It's there. It's always there. But from our perspective, I think we're really looking for solutions that make sense and are more targeted towards local conditions versus sort of this one-size-fits-all approach, which affects our community that doesn't have the water supply challenges and that Southern California is certainly facing.
This AB 1572, I understand that you're opposed to it, but, there's a lot of public landscaping in Roseville, and a lot of trees that make Roseville a really nice place where there isn't any recycled lines available. And if this became law, all of that would be lost.
Yeah, and unfortunately, currently, what we've seen is that the elements of 1572 have actually been in place because they've put it under an emergency regulation. So that's been in place now for several months, if not almost a year. And so what that bill is reflective of is this sort of policy desire to take what's a emergency regulation and actually put it in a statute as a permanent impact.
Oh, yeah, I understand what they're trying to do.
Yeah,
I just
yeah.
hope that we're successful in saving a wonderful amenity for our city.
Yeah, and I think certainly we're very cognizant of that, and I think we're really looking at those opportunities where, if this ends up becoming something that's built into statute, or even while we're in this emergency regulation perspective, is how can we work in partnership with commercial property owners, also looking at city properties and really making sure that we try to save that tree canopy, which takes years and years to get to where it's at. And it's, as you said, Einar, it's an aesthetic, right? And it's actually beneficial for the health of the community to have those types of tree canopies there and that the grass to be able to recreate things like that.
And not to be too overly redundant, we have an adequate water supply
That is
to meet
correct.
those needs.
Yes, that is correct. Absolutely.
So my follow-up question, you mentioned, the emergency regs. Are we still on water days? Are we still on whatever the schedule is?
Yeah, so this is an interesting, I won't get too far into the nitty-gritty of it, but we, the city, have been in a stage 2 for quite some time, and that's a stage that's activated through our municipal code. So based on water supply conditions, we kind of, more or less had a good general sense of where we're at by January, February, right? We also had a 100%, eventually 100% allocation of our CVP supply. So based on watershed conditions and where that allocation is as far as our CVP contract, our water supply situation is solid for the year. We can serve all the needs based on surface water and then some. But the challenge is that, and we've worked with our city manager to provide recommendations, and he accepted those recommendations, is that, there's desire from a local policy perspective to wind down that stage 2 drought pretty much 2 months ago, right? However, you've got emergency regulations that have been imposed by the State Water Board. Those regulations are actually in effect until June 10th. So what that essentially forced was it trumped, if you will, our local decision-making authority to be able to wind down that stage 2. And we basically had to ensure that we kept that stage 2 in place so that we remain compliant with the emergency regulations that are in effect until June 10th. Now, starting June 11th, we are going to return back to a basic stage based on the acceptance of the recommendations by our city manager, who has the ultimate call.
Well, we're buying surplus water from the Bureau.
Correct. It's a strange situation, but that's the reality of where we're at, right? So,
Are the watering days being enforced?
So right now, what we're really trying to do is we're trying to really emphasize public outreach and education. That's our main focus. We're not. We have our stage 2 in place, which does have watering days in effect. But in terms of where we're focusing on our energy, it's really trying to make the shift from emphasizing water conservation, which is you're taking that as an activity because you have some type of water shortage situation, and shifting that over to more of a water efficiency sort of standpoint. So that's where we're really having staff, put their time and energy towards, is really public education. Trying to get them plugged into some of our normal rebate programs, things like that. We need to continue to do that regardless of the water year type, but really not focusing in on some of the other activities per se, that we would normally do in a water shortage type of situation.
Any other questions from the commission? Are there any, is there anyone from the public who would like to come forward and address the commission on this item? Well, I want to say thank you. We have one more item on tonight's agenda, which is an environmental utilities budget overview. This report is from our Environmental Utilities Assistant Director, Sean Bigley, and he'll be summarizing for our information the environmental utilities budget.
Well, thank you again. I will try to make this efficient. And so thank you again. This is a presentation that provides a budget overview for environmental utilities. And so first, next slide, please. So just a quick overview in terms of laying out sort of how we look at our sort of fiscal position and our planning. And so first, just noting that the utility is very much a growing utility, growing in the respect of meeting the community's needs. Obviously, Roseville is a growing community, and so we need to keep pace with that and keep pace with expectations. We're also progressive in the extent that, or in the context of ensuring that we are advancing. We're trying to, make sure that we are using or leveraging technology and other more modern methods to provide the most efficient service possible. And we also remain very customer focused. So in terms of our financial planning and forecasting, we utilize our rate process as an ability to look out 10 years to look at what our needs are. And those needs are basically to cover costs. We're not a profit organization. We're set up to basically bring in the needed revenue to be able to meet the operational needs of the utilities under environmental utilities. We like to say that we focus in on the highest value, but we're not necessarily the lowest cost. And so bringing that high value is very important, but we do so in a very, very efficient way. In the past, we've reported our customer service satisfaction levels based on our surveys that we do every 2 years. We maintain a 98% customer satisfaction level. We work really hard to maintain that by our interactions and our service levels to our customers. So we're funded by user fees. We're not funded by taxes. We run more like a business in terms of our day-to-day activities. Based on council policy, rate adjustments or rate analyses occur every 2 years. And what we tend to focus on is that if there's rate adjustments that are needed, we want to smooth those out, make those smaller but more frequent over time. And so that's really in the interest of our customers to make sure that we smooth out those impacts and avoid things like rate shocks, things like that. We're also a significant contributor to the general fund, much like Roseville Electric. Again, we're focused on continued service, reliability, and rehabilitation of our system. Next slide, please. So in terms of just a general comparison of our budgeted operational expenses, I won't go through all the numbers here, but you can kind of see the difference between FY23 and 24. Generally, there's largely stable budgeted expenses. They do vary from time to time, depending on activities that are occurring in each of the utilities. But this is just sort of a look in terms of comparing the current fiscal year compared to what the next budget looks like. Next slide, please. This is an expense forecast. This basically just shows among the three utilities what those expenses look like. The largest of the utilities in terms of expenses is our wastewater utility. As the PUC is quite aware of, our wastewater utility provides wastewater services not only to the city of Roseville, but we also operate 2 regional wastewater treatment plants. And so those expenses obviously are in play in terms of providing those services. The next largest is the water utility, and then following that is our waste services utility. So generally speaking, waste services and water are largely closely the same in terms of expenses, and the wastewater is obviously much larger. Next slide, please. Just a little bit about our focus areas. Really, in terms of our core functions, what we're looking at are really 4 specific areas. I'll go into details briefly on that. First is just fiscal performance, making sure we're minding the money in terms of how we utilize the resources that are under the care of the utilities and making sure that we are good stewards of those resources. As you heard, Noel provided some information in terms of our ongoing legislative and regulatory efforts. And again, that's to ensure that we are really trying to reduce the impacts of unfunded mandates. A lot of the unfunded mandates that we see come from the state of California through the legislature. But there are other activities from time to time that come from the federal government. On the offense portion of it, if you will, as Noel indicated, we're also looking for opportunities to engage both the state and federal government in terms of funding infrastructure. Most specifically, recently, the federal government has opened up the congressionally directed spending request processes, and so we're positioning the utility to take advantage of that and bring that benefit back to our customer base. Reliability is a big aspect of what we do. If you don't have a reliable set of utilities, you don't provide that value to our customer, obviously. So we're 24/7, 365 operation. And so we're always focused on making sure we're really increasing that reliability over time by making really strategic investments. And then finally, just workforce development, really kind of creating the future to meet the needs of our customers down the road. So fiscal performance. So just really quickly, we're in the second year of a 2-year rate case. We did see some eroding of rate gains or revenue related to increasing eroding of our gains through the rate adjustment by the increase in expenses, largely due to the inflationary factors that have been in play. We've seen things like increases in chemical costs. Materials costs have gone up significantly. We have seen some instability up and down over time. I would say last year was probably the most acute year that we had to deal with that, but we're still seeing some of those lagging effects relative to inflation. As we presented earlier, rate adjustments are scheduled for FY '24. So starting in July 1st of 2023, for the typical customer, the water rate would go up by $2.10 per month, wastewater $2.86 per month, and there's no increase for waste services. That actually translates, again, for a 2-year process, at a 4% increase on water rates and a 6% increase for wastewater. And then in conjunction with an audit, we're looking at currently working with our Chief Financial Officer on enhanced internal controls and structures. Next slide, please. So I won't go into this in a lot of detail. I'll just kind of really, again, acknowledge what Noella just presented in regarding advanced clean fleets and the impact of that on our fleets starting in 2024. We also have another regulation in play relative to updates to the lead and copper regulation on the federal side. It's going to require us to do a desktop analysis to understand where potential lead exists in our system. On the city side of the system, a lot of this work's already been done based on sort of state and federal requirements. And based on the desktop analysis, what this new regulation update will require us to do is to start to look at what is occurring on the customer side of the system and determining what areas need to be looked at in terms of potential changes to some of those connections on the customer side of the system. So you see no cost associated with that because we don't know the extent of the potential problem. But suffice to say, that's going to could obviously create a significant cost for the utility. And of course, we'll be coming back to the Public Utilities Commission to provide an update once we finish up that desktop analysis by 2024. We continue to work towards implementing the very robust set of water efficiency mandates that were passed as a package of legislation in 2018. And so those efficiency standards are going through the process of regulatory implementation. And so we are making investments to be able to make sure that the city is ultimately compliant with those standards once they go into effect. Water loss performance standards is kind of a tangentially related item to the water efficiency standards, and that really just looks at reducing system leakage by identifying leaks in the system. Obviously, also looking at things like pressure standards and meter calibration, and this is something that the State Water Board has been engaged in. I'll just say it's one of those situations where we are starting to see significant creep of the state of California into our operation in terms of how we operate the system. And so things like these water loss performance standards, although it's helpful to reduce water loss in our system for a variety of reasons, I would definitely say this is a significant overreach by the state of California. So, and it will it will result in cost impacts to the utility. So on resource portfolio, just really quickly, we've talked a lot about just the continued expansion of our aquifer storage and recovery program. We are also continuing to work with Placer County Water Agency as a partner to create added water supply reliability to the city, as well as working with them as partners to provide benefits on their end as well. We are continuing to conduct an environmental review of the proposed Utility Operations Center. We are getting pretty close to wrapping up the Pleasant Grove wastewater treatment plant expansion completion. We're doing some final sort of punch list items that need to be wrapped up. And then we're continuing to invest in rehabilitation of our assets, looking at things like our Barton Road water treatment plant that was brought online in 1971. Our wastewater treatment plants obviously need continued rehabilitation based on those facilities. And then in terms of investments in some of the distribution systems, we're looking at various improvements. A lot of it right now is focused in on the core of Roseville. We just got done last year with a significant rehabilitation of water infrastructure in the Hillcrest neighborhood. We're doing some other investments in the sort of adjacent neighborhood, and then we have some other neighborhoods that we intend to go into ahead of Public Works repaving the roads, go in, update that infrastructure, and then they can pave the roads and go from there. Then finally, on workforce development, as an organization, we need to continue to look at our structure and make sure that structure aligns with the needs of our customers and the needs of the community. So we, from our perspective, definitely have a growing workload within the utility, and the mission continues to evolve to meet the needs. We're also very focused on recruiting and retaining key people and maintaining capabilities to in the utility, and this remains a challenge. It's a very competitive labor market currently. And so things like on the engineering side, getting engineers with experience is a very difficult undertaking. We also are looking for sort of key positions like instrumentation and control technicians, folks that understand programming on the SCADA side, folks that know how to weld. So it kind of spans the operation in terms of getting those key people in. And then we're very focused on using values and culture to drive a positive change within the organization and really keep our team very focused in on the core mission of what we're trying to provide for the community. So with that is my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Questions from the commission?
Very welcome.
Okay. Is there anyone from the public who'd like to address the commission on this item? We have public comment.
Good evening. My name is Lauren Meeks Harris, and I just had a question regarding, you were saying a shortage of workers. One of the things I would like to see as the new generation and everything is that maybe we should start doing is maybe bringing people with inexperience and pairing them with people with experience, like maybe an in-house. I know it would cost Roseville probably a pretty penny, but if we invest now, we won't have at least a home court advantage type of. And this is something to consider. I'm looking at, we have the community college here, we have Sierra and neighboring college districts. Not everybody's going to college, but I mean, there's trade programs out there, and maybe we can start getting people as early as they can qualify, or at least help them. Like, we have summer programs. We have the people who do the pools and the other park and rec things. And I think maybe for the jobs that we can't find people for, let's start maybe bridging a gap on that. I don't know if Roseville is looking into that. I know that's a little bit out of maybe this commission scope, but I hope that you guys make a somebody could make a recommendation that we look into that, so we're not having to do a nationwide search for somebody who may stay 1 or 2 years. We need homegrown people.
Thank you for your comment.
I think that's a great idea. We just started a mentorship program at work doing the exact same thing.
Vice Chair Webb, I'd be happy to address the question
if you would like
if
to,
I
yes.
may. Okay. So the good news is I would just want to kind of just very briefly just let you know what we're working on with respect to that. So there's a couple of areas that we're actually investing staff time in. So currently through the Roseville Chamber and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, they actually have a talent pipeline management program that we're actually plugged into. And so the nice part of it is that they are focusing in on sort of the utility sector. And so through that process, and we have an assigned staff person engaged in that process, they're looking at some opportunities where, number one, they are letting us identify those key positions, the ones I articulated in the presentation, and really looking for developing some strategies to do that. In addition, we are working with Sierra College. They're actually looking at developing a program to meet the need in terms of those specific utility-related occupations, and so bringing students through that program. And so we've been interacting with them in terms of making sure that we provide what actual positions we're looking to fill and how can we kind of help that program evolve moving forward. So we just don't talk about specifically workforce development. We're actually making investments specifically in it because we have a vested stake in making sure that we not only look through regular searches that we have through our city process, but we actually need to get more active and really try to really think creatively about how we make that happen. So it's based on the work where the labor market is right now. It's just doing sort of a passive sort of effort just doesn't cut it. So anyway, so that's where the utility is with respect to those activities.
Thank you for your comment.
Sure.
Any other questions, comments? I want to thank you for your budget overview, Sean. The next thing on our agenda is board member and commissioner and staff reports. Are there any reports from staff? Not. Are there questions or comments from the commission? I'd like to make a comment. Blandon Granger has been a part of this commission for 2 full terms and a partial term, which is almost 12 years. I really want to thank you, and I'm sure the staff would like to thank you for your commitment and contributions to our group and our city. He would normally have his last meeting in June, but will not be able to join us, which is why we're bringing it up now. And I want to say thank you, and thank you again. So, not seeing any more questions or comments from the commission, are there any proposed future agenda items? Okay, I don't see that. May I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll second.
Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you so much.